Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel reach more people who need a quiet place to rest at night. And if you fall asleep before it ends, that is perfectly fine. That is exactly what this is here for. Just let the words carry you down. Tonight we are going to follow a single day, not a day in the life of a king, or a general, or a pope, or any of the men whose names fill the history books and whose decisions shaped the world in ways that everyone agrees were significant. Tonight we are going to follow a day in the life of a woman whose name you almost certainly do not know, whose decisions shaped the world in ways that almost no one has ever fully acknowledged, and whose life was simultaneously more constrained and more powerful, more dangerous and more extraordinary than almost anything the popular imagination has assigned to her. Tonight we follow a medieval queen, not a fairy tale queen, not the queen of a children's story sitting in a tower with long golden hair, waiting for something to happen, the real thing, a woman who woke before dawn in a room that was cold even in summer, who managed the finances of a kingdom before breakfast, who navigated the most complex political landscape in the known world with no formal authority and near absolute practical power, who bore children at intervals that were dangerous to her life and politically essential to her dynasty, who outlived husbands and sons and daughters and enemies, who was imprisoned and exiled and restored and imprisoned again, and who did all of this within a framework of rules so elaborate and so demanding and so specifically designed to constrain her, that the fact that she succeeded at anything at all is, when you look at it honestly, one of the most remarkable stories in human history. She woke before dawn. This is where we begin. The Queen's bedchamber in a medieval castle was not the private sanctuary that the word bedchamber suggests to modern ears. It was a political space. The ladies-in-waiting who slept in the same room, sometimes on trundle beds pulled out from under the Queen's own bed, sometimes on pallets along the walls, sometimes in an adjoining room with the door open, were not simply personal servants. They were the daughters and wives of the most powerful noble families in the kingdom, placed in the Queen's household as a form of political alliance, as a mechanism for keeping the Queen under observation, and as a way of training young noblewomen in the specific arts of court life that would determine their own futures. The Queen was never alone. This was not an accident. It was a rule, enforced not by any single law, but by the accumulated weight of custom and political necessity, and the specific vulnerabilities of a queen's position in a world that was simultaneously dependent on her and deeply suspicious of her. The first thing the queen did upon waking, before she spoke to anyone, before she allowed her ladies to begin the long process of dressing her, was pray. The religious observance that structured the medieval day, the canonical hours that divided the 24 hours of the day into specific periods of prayer, each with its own name and its own character and its own obligations, was not optional for anyone in medieval Christian society, and it was especially not optional for a queen, whose piety was considered a public matter, a performance of virtue that had political as well as spiritual dimensions. A queen who was not visibly devout was a queen whose moral authority was in question, and a queen whose moral authority was in question was a queen whose political position was vulnerable. The prayers were sincere. They were also strategic. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the Queen understood both of them without experiencing any particular contradiction, because she lived in a world where the sacred and the political were not separate categories. The dressing process that followed the morning prayers was itself a ritual of considerable complexity and considerable political significance. The Queen's clothing was not simply clothing. It was a statement about her status, about her family's wealth, about the kingdom's prosperity, about her own taste and judgment, and the specific image she wished to project to the court and to the foreign ambassadors, and to the populations who would catch a glimpse of her on ceremonial occasions. The fabrics were the most expensive available. Silk from the Italian city-states, velvet from the Low Countries, fine wool from England, linen of extraordinary fineness from Flanders. The colours were chosen with care because colours carried meaning in medieval culture in ways that were immediately legible to everyone who saw them. Certain colours were associated with specific virtues, specific saints, specific political allegiances, and a queen who appeared in the wrong colour at the wrong moment was making a statement she might not have intended. The ladies who dressed her had specific roles and specific hierarchies among themselves. The lady who handed the queen her shift, the first garment, the one closest to the body, was performing a role of genuine intimacy and genuine trust, and the woman who held that role was typically the queen's closest personal ally among the ladies, the one whose loyalty had been tested and whose discretion had been demonstrated over years. The lady who placed the crown or the coronet or the specific head covering appropriate to the occasion was performing a different kind of role, more ceremonial, more public, more about the queen's identity as a royal figure rather than as a private person. Every element of the dressing process had its protocol. Every protocol had its meaning. And the queen who understood all of these meanings, who could navigate the elaborate choreography of the morning ritual with grace and precision and the appearance of effortless ease, this queen was already demonstrating, before she had spoken a single word to anyone outside her bedchamber, that she was exactly what she was supposed to be. The breakfast that followed was not a casual meal. Nothing in the queen's day was casual. The food served to the queen was tasted by a member of her household before she ate it, a precaution against poison that was not paranoia but prudent risk management in a world where poisoning was a real and relatively common method of political assassination. The taster's role was hereditary in some households, passed from father to son as a mark of trust and honour, which tells you something about the particular combination of intimacy and danger that characterized life in close proximity to medieval royalty. The people most trusted by the queen were also the people most exposed to the risks that surrounded her, and the acceptance of those risks was itself a demonstration of loyalty that the queen recognized and rewarded. The food itself was governed by rules, the rules of feast and fast that the church calendar imposed on all Christians, and the additional rules of courtly dining that determined what was appropriate for a woman of the queen's rank to eat, in what quantities, in what order, with what accompaniments. Medieval medical theory, based on the Galenic system of humours that classified all foods as hot or cold, wet or dry, and prescribed dietary regimes based on the balance of humours in the individual body, was applied to the queen's diet with particular attention because the queen's body was not merely her own. It was a political asset, a vessel for producing heirs, a biological guarantee of dynastic continuity, and its health was accordingly a matter of state concern as well as personal concern. The physicians who attended the queen had opinions about what she should eat, and those opinions were sometimes followed and sometimes ignored, depending on the queen's own preferences and the relative strength of her relationship with her medical attendants. The business of the morning began in earnest after breakfast, and here is where the gap between the formal structure of medieval queenship and its actual practice becomes most visible and most interesting. In the formal constitutional theory of medieval kingdoms, the queen had no official political role. The king governed, the king made decisions, the king issued laws and commanded armies and negotiated treaties and allocated resources and did everything that governing a medieval kingdom required. The queen's role was, in theory, to be the king's wife, to bear his children, to manage his household, and to be gracious and beautiful and pious and silent on the subjects that actually mattered. In practice, the queen was frequently the most important political actor in the kingdom after the king himself, and sometimes more important than the king, and occasionally in the long periods when the king was absent on campaign, or incapacitated by illness, or simply less intelligent and less energetic than his wife, effectively the sole governing power in the realm. She accomplished this through a combination of formal and informal mechanisms that together constituted one of the most sophisticated exercises in the management of power without formal authority in the history of human politics. She controlled access to the king. In a world where political business was conducted through personal relationship, where the ability to speak to the king directly was the prerequisite for getting anything done, and where the king's household was managed by the queen's power to determine who saw the king, when, in what circumstances, and with what prior briefing, was enormous. A petitioner who had the queen's support arrived in the king's presence already advantaged. A petitioner who had the queen's opposition arrived, if he arrived at all, already disadvantaged. The queen did not need to make decisions to shape decisions. She needed only to control the environment in which decisions were made. She managed patronage. The medieval court was a patronage economy, a system in which advancement depended on the support of powerful individuals who could recommend, sponsor, protect, and reward those who served them well. The queen had her own network of patronage relationships, her own clients and dependents who owed their positions to her support, and whose loyalty was therefore to her rather than to the king or to any other powerful figure. These networks were built over years, maintained through constant attention, and constituted a form of political capital that was real and significant even though it appeared nowhere in the formal constitutional structure of the kingdom. She managed information. In a world without newspapers or postal systems or any of the modern technologies of communication, information was scarce, valuable, and unevenly distributed, and the people who controlled its flow had power that was disproportionate to their formal position. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting were present in every significant social gathering at court. They heard conversations, observed interactions, noted who was speaking to whom and in what tone and with what apparent result. The Queen sat at the centre of this information network, receiving reports, synthesizing observations, building a picture of the court's political landscape that was often more complete and more accurate than the picture available to the king's formal advisers, who were themselves political actors with their own interests and their own reasons to present information selectively. She corresponded. The Queen's correspondence was one of her most important political tools, and the letters that survive from medieval queens are among the most remarkable documents in the historical record. Letters of remarkable sophistication and strategic intelligence, managing relationships across vast distances, maintaining alliances, gathering information, applying pressure, offering support, doing all of the things that effective political communication does, in a medium that was simultaneously more durable and more dangerous than speech. A letter could be read by anyone who intercepted it. A letter could be used as evidence against its author. A letter committed to permanent record things that a conversation left unrecorded. Writing a letter was therefore an act of calculated risk, and the Queen who wrote letters was making constant judgments about what could safely be committed to writing and what had to remain in the realm of spoken words and personal meetings and deniable understandings. The morning audience, the formal period during which the Queen received petitioners, conducted interviews, managed her household's business, and performed the various ceremonial functions that her position required, lasted several hours, and was conducted according to a protocol as elaborate as anything else in the Queen's day. The order in which petitioners were received signalled their relative importance. The physical space in which the audience was conducted, the Queen's presence chamber, a room specifically designed for this purpose, furnished and decorated in ways that communicated the Queen's power and the seriousness of the business conducted there, was managed with care. The Queen sat, others stood. The physical arrangement of the space translated the political hierarchy into a spatial reality that was immediately legible to everyone present. The petitioners who came before her in the morning audience ranged across the full spectrum of the court's population. There were noble women seeking her intercession in disputes with their husbands or their neighbours. There were merchants seeking her support for commercial ventures that required royal approval. There were ecclesiastical officials seeking her influence with the king on matters of church policy. There were foreign agents seeking her assistance in communications with their own sovereigns. There were members of her own household seeking resolution of internal disputes. And there were people who simply wanted to be seen by the Queen, who understood that visibility at court was itself a form of political currency. That being known to have access to the Queen was valuable even if nothing specific was achieved in any particular audience, and that the regular cultivation of the Queen's attention was an investment in relationships that might pay dividends at some future moment of need. The Queen's intercession, her formal request to the king on behalf of a petitioner, was one of the most important and most carefully managed aspects of her political role. The tradition of queenly intercession was ancient and formally recognized, rooted in theological imagery of the Virgin Mary interceding with God on behalf of sinful humanity, and it gave the Queen a legitimate and acknowledged mechanism for influencing royal decisions without formally challenging the king's authority. She did not make the decision. She asked the king to reconsider. She expressed her own feelings about the matter. She placed the weight of her personal relationship with the king, which was itself a form of political capital, behind a specific outcome. The king could refuse. Kings did refuse. But a request from the queen was not easily dismissed, and a king who routinely dismissed his queen's intercessions was a king who was damaging a relationship that he needed, for reasons that extended well beyond the political. The most skilled queens used intercession with extraordinary precision, choosing carefully which requests to bring before the king, timing them to moments when the king was most receptive, framing them in ways that appealed to the king's own interests and values, and building a track record of successful intercessions that enhanced both their own reputation for effectiveness and their petitioners' gratitude. A queen who was known to be effective was a queen whose support was actively sought, whose patronage was valued, and whose political network therefore grew stronger over time. The power of intercession compounded, in the way that all forms of political capital compound when they are managed skillfully. The midday meal was the most important meal of the medieval day, the equivalent of the modern dinner, the main occasion of communal eating that brought the court together, and that performed, through its elaborate rituals of seating and service and precedence, the social hierarchy of the kingdom in edible form. The queen sat at the high table, elevated above the rest of the hall on a dais, visible to everyone present, her position literally higher than that of everyone below her. The order in which people were seated relative to the queen communicated their rank. The quality of the food served to different tables communicated rank. The order in which dishes were served, the number of courses, the specific foods offered at the royal table, and the specific foods offered to lower tables, all of it was a performance of the social order, an enactment in food and space and time of the hierarchy that governed every other aspect of medieval life. The queen ate and was watched. This was a permanent condition of her existence. She was always performing, always observed, always aware that her behavior was being noted and interpreted and discussed by the people around her. The ability to perform effortlessly under constant observation, to project ease and grace, and the particular quality of serene authority that queenship required, while simultaneously managing everything that was actually happening in her mind. This was the central skill of medieval queenship, and it was a skill that was never fully learned, never entirely mastered, always requiring the same effort, regardless of how long it had been practiced. After the midday meal came the afternoon, and the afternoon was in some ways the most interesting part of the Queen's day, because it was the part in which the formal structure of the day relaxed slightly, and the Queen had something approaching, not freedom, nothing in her life was ever freedom in the modern sense, but a slightly wider margin of choice about how she spent her time. She might walk in the castle gardens, which were not merely decorative but productive, medicinal herbs, fruit trees, vegetables, and which provided the kind of physical movement that a life lived largely indoors in heavy clothing required. She might supervise needlework with her ladies, which was not the idle pastime it appears in retrospect, but a form of production. The embroidery and weaving that the Queen's household produced was economically significant, and the Queen who managed it well was managing a real economic enterprise. She might receive private visitors, the conversations that could not happen in the formal setting of the morning audience, the meetings that required a degree of privacy that the presence chamber did not offer. The Queen's private chamber, the room behind the presence chamber that was accessible only to those she specifically admitted, was the most politically sensitive space in the castle, after the king's own private rooms. The people who were admitted to it were the people the Queen trusted most, or was negotiating with most carefully, or needed to speak to about things that could not be spoken in public. The management of access to the private chamber was itself a political act, and the Queen who managed it well was the Queen who understood that privacy was power, that the ability to conduct business outside the observation of the court was essential to the kind of complex political management that effective queenship required. Let your thoughts slow a little now. The image of the garden in the afternoon light, the Queen walking among the herbs with one trusted lady a few steps behind her, speaking in low tones about something that would never be written down, something that would shape the next month's political landscape in ways that no chronicle would ever record, because chronicles recorded what kings did, and rarely paused to consider how those decisions had been shaped by the conversations that preceded them. The garden and the low voices and the herbs and the afternoon light coming through the gap in the castle wall. We continue. The needlework that occupied the Queen's ladies during the afternoon hours was not silent work. The workroom where the ladies gathered was one of the most important spaces of informal information exchange in the medieval castle. A place where conversation flowed freely in the way it could not flow in the formal settings of the court, where news was shared and opinions were expressed, and the constant social processing that human beings require was conducted without the constraints of ceremony and protocol. The Queen sat at the centre of this space and listened as much as she spoke. The information she gathered from her ladies' conversations, the gossip, the observations, the reports of what was being said in the less observed corners of the court, was as politically valuable as anything she received from formal advisers, and she knew it. The ladies themselves were political actors in their own right, managing their own relationships and their own interests within the framework of the Queen's household. The competition for the Queen's favour among the ladies was constant, sometimes fierce, and occasionally brutal in the specifically female form that competition for favour in a closed social system tends to take. The carefully placed word, the strategic silence, the friendship offered and withdrawn, the alliance built and the enemy made in the course of a single afternoon's needlework session. The Queen managed these dynamics as she managed everything else, with attention, with patience, with the particular skill of a person who understood that the stability of her household was itself a political asset that needed to be maintained. The Vespers prayer that marked the transition from afternoon to evening was another of the canonical hours that structured the medieval day, and it was observed with the same combination of genuine devotion and political performance that characterized all of the Queen's religious observance. The chapel attached to the royal apartment was a beautiful space. Medieval queens typically had considerable influence over the decoration of the spaces they inhabited, and the chapel was often among the most elaborately decorated rooms in the castle, filled with the specific combination of colour and light and scent and sound that medieval Christian liturgy deployed to create the experience of the sacred. The stained glass, the embroidered altar cloths, the candles and the incense and the voices of the chaplains, all of it worked together to produce an environment in which the experience of prayer was genuinely different from the experience of the rest of the day, in which something that was not available in the audience chamber or the garden or the needlework room was available. Whether the Queen found genuine spiritual consolation in these moments is something the historical record cannot tell us with certainty, because the historical record about medieval queens' inner lives is inevitably filtered through layers of political management and social performance and the specific conventions of medieval writing about women, which tended to assign to women either the virtue of the saint or the vice of the temptress, and rarely found the language for the complex, intelligent, politically sophisticated reality that lay between those two poles. What we can say is that many medieval queens were genuinely, deeply religious in ways that shaped their decisions and their relationships and their understanding of their own role in the world. The religion was not merely a performance. It was a framework, a way of understanding what was happening to them and why, a source of comfort in circumstances that frequently required comfort, and a set of values that sometimes, in specific moments, actually constrained what they were willing to do in the service of their political interests. The evening meal was lighter than the midday feast, a supper rather than a dinner, less elaborate, less ceremonial, though still governed by the protocols of rank and precedence that governed every communal activity at court. After supper came the evening's entertainment, music, poetry, perhaps a performance by travelling players or minstrels, the social activities that constituted the court's cultural life, and that were, like everything else, simultaneously genuine pleasure and political performance. The queen, who was a skilled musician, who could play the lute or the harp, who could sing, was demonstrating a form of cultivation that carried real social prestige. The queen who commissioned poetry from court poets, who was known as a patron of the arts, was building a reputation that extended beyond the court, and that contributed to the image of her kingdom as a centre of civilization rather than merely a military power. The troubadour tradition that had shaped so much of medieval aristocratic culture had assigned to the queen and the great noble ladies a specific role in cultural patronage, as the audiences for and the inspiration of the poetry of courtly love, as the arbiters of the refined sensibility that distinguished the noble from the merely powerful. Some medieval queens took this role seriously as a genuine cultural mission, maintaining courts that were recognized throughout Europe as centers of literary and musical sophistication. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was Queen first of France and then of England in the 12th century, is perhaps the most famous example, a woman whose court in Poitiers was one of the most important centers of troubadour culture in Europe, whose patronage shaped the development of the Romance literary tradition, and whose political life was eventful enough to fill several volumes of history. Eleanor was imprisoned by her husband Henry II of England for 16 years for supporting a rebellion by their sons against their father. She emerged from imprisonment at the age of approximately 67 when Henry died, and spent the next decade actively governing England as regent for her son Richard I, and then managing the enormous ransom required to free Richard from captivity in Austria. She died at approximately 82, which by any standard of any era is a remarkable lifespan for a person who had experienced what she had experienced, and she was politically active until very near the end. Eleanor is exceptional in the specifics but representative in the general shape of her experience, the combination of genuine power and genuine constraint, of remarkable achievement and remarkable suffering, of a life lived in the full complexity of a position that was simultaneously the most exalted available to a woman in her world and one of the most dangerous. She is exceptional also in the degree to which her story has been preserved, which itself tells us something important about the historical record. Eleanor's story survives because she was unusually prominent, unusually consequential, and unusually connected to the literary culture that produced the documents from which history is written. The stories of the thousands of other medieval queens and noble women whose lives were equally complex and equally significant are far less completely preserved, because the machinery of historical record-keeping was not designed to capture them. This is one of the things that makes the study of medieval queenship both fascinating and genuinely difficult. The sources are partial in both senses of the word, incomplete, and shaped by perspectives that were not the queen's own. The chronicles that recorded medieval history were written almost exclusively by men, usually by clergy, who brought to their observation of women a set of assumptions and expectations and frameworks for interpretation that often prevented them from seeing what was actually happening in front of them. A queen who managed her court brilliantly might be described as gracious and pious and beautiful without any acknowledgement of the political intelligence that her gracious and pious and beautiful conduct was serving. A queen who intervened in political affairs in ways that her contemporaries found threatening might be described as scheming or ambitious or sexually manipulative rather than in the terms of political analysis that would have been applied to a man doing the same things. Reading medieval sources about queens requires, therefore, a specific kind of attention, a willingness to read against the grain of the text, to notice what is described without being recognized as significant, to pay attention to the actions recorded even when the interpretation offered by the chronicler is inadequate or actively misleading. When a chronicle notes that the queen spoke to the king privately before a particular decision was made, and then notes the decision, the connection between those two facts is often not made explicit, because the chronicler's framework does not easily accommodate the idea that the queen's private conversation with the king was the cause of the decision, rather than a coincidence that preceded it. Reading for those connections, making visible the political logic that the sources present but do not analyze, is one of the central tasks of medieval women's history. The evening ended with the final prayers of the day, Compline, the canonical hour that completed the day's cycle of prayer, that marked the transition from wakefulness to sleep, that committed the sleeper and the sleeping world to God's protection for the hours of darkness. The queen knelt again, in the chapel or at the prie-dieu in her bedchamber, and spoke the words that had been spoken at the end of every day since the early centuries of Christian monasticism, words worn smooth by repetition into a kind of groove that the mind could follow without effort, a path that led, if you let it, from the noise and complexity of the day into something quieter. The ladies helped her undress, reversing the morning's process in reverse order, each step governed by the same protocols, each garment removed with the same care with which it had been put on. The jewellery was stored, the elaborate headdress removed, the hair unbound. A moment of genuine physical relief after hours in the constriction of formal dress, a moment also of particular vulnerability. The queen without her public armour, without the visual signals of her status and her power, just a woman at the end of a day that had required everything she had, and then a little more. The curtains of the bed were drawn. The ladies settled into their places around the room. The candles were snuffed one by one until the room was dark, except for the small flame of the nightlight kept burning in a corner, a precaution against the complete darkness that medieval people, with considerably more reason than modern people, genuinely feared. And in the darkness, in the warmth of the bed with its heavy curtains and its thick coverings, the queen lay still. What did she think about in those last minutes before sleep? The historical record inevitably cannot tell us. It can tell us what she did and what she said in public, and what others said about her, and what decisions were made, and what letters were written, and what alliances were formed, and what enemies were made. It cannot tell us what she thought in the dark, alone with herself in a way that she was alone at no other moment of her day. Whether she was afraid, whether she was satisfied, whether she thought about the children she had borne and lost, the children who had not survived infancy, the children who had survived and grown into allies or enemies or strangers, the children who were hostages in foreign courts or heirs to kingdoms she would never see. Whether she thought about the king, about the marriage that was the foundation of everything she had and everything she was, about the relationship that was simultaneously personal and political and sacred and impossibly complicated in ways that no one who had not experienced it could fully understand. Whether she prayed again, in the dark without the formal words, in whatever private language she had developed over a lifetime of talking to God in the spaces between the prescribed prayers. Let your breath slow now. Let the image of the dark room and the drawn curtains and the small flame in the corner settle around you. The queen is still. The castle is still. Outside the walls, the medieval night is doing what medieval nights did, being very dark and very cold, and very full of sounds that the walled enclosure of the castle kept at a manageable distance. Dogs somewhere, wind, the creak of the structure settling, the distant sound of the watch making their rounds on the battlements, the footsteps and the lantern light that meant the castle was being kept, that someone was awake so that everyone else could sleep. She is not finished. The day we are following is only the first of many days we will spend in her company tonight. There is much more to understand about how she navigated the world she lived in, about the specific crises she faced, the specific decisions she made, the specific rules she operated within, and occasionally bent and occasionally broke and occasionally rewrote through the sheer force of her intelligence and her will. There is much more to understand about what it meant to be a woman of extraordinary capability in a world that had elaborate and rigid ideas about what women were for and what they were capable of, and what happened to the ones who exceeded those expectations. But for this moment, let the dark and the quiet hold you. Let the medieval night settle around the castle, and the castle settle around the queen, and the queen settle into the darkness behind her closed eyes. Let the day's complexity dissolve slowly into the simpler language of the body at rest, the warmth, the stillness, the breath going slow and slower and slower still. We will continue when you are ready. There is more night ahead, and more story, and more of the long, complicated, remarkable life that we are following through its hours. But for now, rest. Simply rest. The Queen's power was most visible in the moments when it was most threatened. This is one of the counterintuitive truths about medieval queenship that the historical record reveals with remarkable consistency, that the women who left the deepest marks on the political history of their era were often the women who had been pushed into corners, who had been stripped of the normal mechanisms of influence and forced to operate from a position of apparent weakness, and who had responded to that position not by accepting the diminishment it was intended to produce, but by finding other routes to the same destinations. The queen who was politically comfortable, whose husband was alive and attentive and supportive, whose children were healthy and in their expected places, whose alliances were stable and her enemies manageable. This queen left relatively few traces in the historical record because she did not need to do anything dramatic enough to attract the chronicler's attention. The queen who was in crisis left everything. Eleanor of Aquitaine left everything. We have already met her briefly, but she deserves more careful attention because her life, more than almost any other medieval queen's, illuminates with extraordinary clarity both the possibilities and the limitations of the position. What a woman of exceptional ability could do within the framework of medieval queenship, and what the framework could do to a woman of exceptional ability when it decided to push back. Eleanor was born around Aquitaine 1A22, the eldest daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, a territory in southwestern France that was, by the standards of the time, fabulously wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and politically significant. When William died in 1137, Eleanor inherited Aquitaine, making her at approximately 15 years old one of the most valuable matrimonial prizes in Europe. Within months she was married to Louis VII of France, becoming Queen of France before she had fully finished being a child, entering a court and a marriage and a political role that would have been demanding for a woman twice her age, with twice her experience. The marriage to Louis was, by most accounts, a disaster of temperament, two people who were profoundly unsuited to each other, bound together by a dynastic calculation that had nothing to do with compatibility, and everything to do with territory. Louis was pious and cautious, and inclined toward the contemplative life that his position as king made impossible. Eleanor was energetic, politically engaged, culturally ambitious, and possessed of opinions about everything that she was entirely willing to express, regardless of whether the people around her wanted to hear them. She went on the Second Crusade with Louis, one of the very few queens to accompany a crusading army, and managed to make herself politically controversial in ways that were impressive even by her own standards, generating rumours that have followed her through the historical record ever since about her behaviour in Antioch, where she spent time with her uncle Raymond and allegedly argued publicly with Louis about military strategy in ways that no queen was supposed to argue with a king about anything. The marriage was annulled in 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity. They were distantly related, and the Church's prohibition on marriage within certain degrees of kinship provided a convenient and theologically respectable mechanism for dissolving a marriage that had produced 2 daughters and no sons, and had become politically and personally unsustainable. Eleanor left the French court and within 8 weeks had married Henry, Count of Anjou, who 2 years later became Henry II of England. She was approximately 30 years old. He was approximately 19. The new marriage produced 8 children over the following 13 years, including the future kings Richard I and John. It also produced, eventually, one of the most spectacular marital breakdowns in medieval history. The relationship between Eleanor and Henry was one of the most consequential and most studied in the medieval period, and it illuminates in ways that simpler stories cannot the specific dynamics of power in a medieval royal marriage. Henry was, by any standard, an extraordinary king, energetic, intelligent, legally sophisticated, an administrative reformer whose innovations in English common law created structures that persist to the present day. He was also, by any standard, an extremely difficult husband, serially unfaithful, frequently absent, politically dominant in ways that left Eleanor with considerably less room to operate than she had exercised as Queen of France, and increasingly suspicious of his wife's independent political activities as their marriage aged and soured. Eleanor responded to the constraints of her position with Henry by doing what she had always done, finding the available space, and using it as completely as possible. She governed England as regent during Henry's absences on the continent, managing the kingdom's administration with a competence that the historical record acknowledges even when it does not fully analyse. She maintained her own court, particularly in Poitiers, where she gathered around her the poets and musicians and intellectuals who made her court one of the most culturally significant in Europe. She cultivated relationships with her sons, particularly Richard, her favourite, who shared her cultural interests and her political temperament, in ways that eventually became the foundation for the rebellion that destroyed whatever remained of the marriage. In 1173, Eleanor supported her sons Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey in a rebellion against their father. The rebellion failed. Henry II suppressed it with the combination of military force and political skill that characterized everything he did, and he dealt with the specific problem of his wife by doing something that was legally unusual and politically significant. He imprisoned her. For 16 years, from 1173 to 1189, Eleanor was held in various English castles, under comfortable conditions that reflected her status, but under genuine confinement that reflected his determination to neutralize her as a political force. She was not tortured. She was not publicly shamed. She was simply removed from the political world and kept there, in the particular limbo of a queen who retained her title and her theoretical position while being denied the practical ability to exercise either. The imprisonment of a queen by her husband was not, in medieval law, straightforwardly illegal. The king had broad authority over his household, and the queen was a member of his household. The church, which might have intervened on Eleanor's behalf, she was, after all, a baptized Christian woman with rights under canon law, chose not to, for reasons that illuminate the specific vulnerabilities of a queen who had made herself politically controversial. Eleanor had too many enemies, had pushed too hard against too many boundaries, had been too openly involved in the rebellion against her husband to attract the kind of sympathy that might have generated effective ecclesiastical intervention. She was confined, and she remained confined for 16 years. What she did during those 16 years is not entirely clear from the historical record, which is itself a form of evidence that she was effectively removed from the political world in which the record was generated. She almost certainly continued to correspond, to the degree that her captors allowed. She almost certainly continued to think, to plan, to maintain whatever relationships she could maintain through whatever channels remained available to her. The woman who emerged from imprisonment in 1189, when Henry II died and Richard became king, and one of his first acts was to order his mother's release, was not a broken woman. She was 67 years old, and she was immediately and completely politically active, travelling through England issuing orders in Richard's name, organising the governance of the kingdom, managing the complex political landscape of a realm whose king was about to leave on crusade, and would be absent for years. The specific quality of Eleanor's political intelligence, the thing that made her not just resilient but actually more effective after imprisonment than before it, is worth trying to understand, because it is representative of something that appears across the historical record of medieval queens. The experience of powerlessness, paradoxically, often produced clearer political thinking than the experience of power. A woman who had spent 16 years unable to act but fully capable of observing and analysing, had had 16 years to think about what she had done wrong, what she would do differently, what the actual mechanisms of power were beneath the surface of the formal structures, and what the most efficient use of limited resources would be when resources were once again available. Eleanor emerged from imprisonment with a clarity of political purpose and a precision of political method that she had not entirely possessed when she went in. The imprisonment had been intended to destroy her political effectiveness. It had refined it. The specific crisis that best illustrated her refined capabilities was the ransom of Richard I. Richard, captured in 1192 by Leopold of Austria while returning from the Third Crusade, was held for a ransom of 100,000 marks of silver, an almost incomprehensible sum, roughly 3 times the annual revenue of the English crown. The task of raising this ransom fell primarily to Eleanor, who was in her early 70s, and who approached it with the same combination of energy and strategic intelligence that had characterized her political activity throughout her life. She organized a kingdom-wide tax. She managed the complex negotiations with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who held Richard and who was not inclined to make the transaction easy. She personally escorted the ransom payment to Germany and attended the ceremony of Richard's release. The entire operation, from initial captivity to final release, took approximately 14 months and was managed with a logistical and diplomatic competence that impressed contemporaries and has impressed historians ever since. Eleanor's story is exceptional in its drama and in its documentation, but the specific skills she demonstrated, the management of information, the cultivation of relationships, the exercise of authority in the absence of formal power, the ability to operate effectively in crisis conditions, were the skills of medieval queenship generally, practiced by hundreds of women whose names and stories are less completely preserved, but whose contributions to the governance of their kingdoms were no less real. The queen who did not have Eleanor's specific combination of personal charisma and political genius still had the same structural position and the same basic toolkit, and many of them used that toolkit with considerable effectiveness. The queens who served as regents during their husbands' absences, who governed kingdoms in the king's name while the king was on campaign or on crusade or simply elsewhere, were performing a governmental function that was in practice indistinguishable from actual ruling, even if the theoretical framework insisted that they were merely maintaining the king's authority rather than exercising their own. The decisions they made were real decisions with real consequences. The armies they organized were real armies. The laws they issued were real laws. The governance was real governance, and the fact that it was conducted in someone else's name did not make it less real, or less skillful, or less significant. Blanche of Castile, who served as regent of France twice, first during the minority of her son Louis the Nascene, and then again during his absence on crusade, is one of the most impressive examples of this kind of regency governance. She was Spanish by birth, having come to France as the bride of Louis VIII, and she was therefore perpetually subject to the specific vulnerability of the foreign queen, the queen who was an outsider in her own court, whose loyalties were always potentially suspect, who could always be accused of serving the interests of her native country rather than her adopted one. She managed this vulnerability with the same combination of political skill and personal authority that Eleanor had brought to her own challenges, governing France with remarkable effectiveness for years at a time, and establishing a reputation for administrative competence that was acknowledged even by her enemies. Her relationship with her son Louis, the future saint, the king who would be canonized after his death as Louis IX, is one of the most interesting mother-son relationships in medieval history, and it illuminates the specific dynamics of the Dowager Queen, the Queen Mother, who occupied a position of particular complexity in the medieval court. Louis was devoted to his mother. He was also, as he grew older and more confident in his own judgment, increasingly willing to make decisions that she disagreed with, and the management of that transition from the regency in which Blanche was the effective ruler to the adult kingship in which Louis made his own decisions, required from both of them a degree of political sophistication and emotional intelligence that the historical record suggests they both possessed. The Dowager Queen was, in many respects, the most politically ambiguous figure in the medieval court. She had experience that the reigning queen, who was new to her position, did not have. She had relationships with members of the court that extended back years before the new queen's arrival. She had a son who was the king, and a loyalty to that son that sometimes coincided with, and sometimes conflicted with, the interests of his wife. And she had no formal role, no position in the constitutional structure that acknowledged her experience or her relationships or gave her a recognized place in the governing apparatus. She was politically significant and constitutionally invisible, which was in a sense the defining condition of medieval queenship generalized and made even more extreme. The management of the relationship between the Dowager Queen and the reigning queen was one of the most delicate and most consequential political tasks in any medieval court, and the historical record suggests that it was often managed very badly. The structural incentives pushed the two women toward competition, toward the perception of their interests as opposed rather than aligned, and the personal dimensions of their relationship were always vulnerable to the same kind of court manipulation that was applied to every other significant political relationship. A courtier who wanted to damage the reigning queen could attempt to poison her relationship with the dowager. A courtier who wanted to neutralize the dowager could attempt to convince the reigning queen that her mother-in-law was a threat rather than a resource. These strategies were employed regularly and sometimes successfully, and the courts where they succeeded tended to be courts that functioned worse, that had less political stability, less effective governance, less capacity to manage the inevitable crises that medieval kingship produced. The courts where the relationship between the two women was well managed, where the dowager's experience was available to the reigning queen as a resource rather than a threat, where the reigning queen's position was secure enough that she did not feel the need to neutralize the dowager, where the two women found a working relationship that served both their interests, these courts tended to function better. The political intelligence of the women involved was a genuine governing resource, and the courts that used it well governed better than the courts that wasted it in internal competition. This is one of the most important and most consistently ignored truths about medieval political history, that the intelligence and capability of the women in the royal household was a real governing resource, and that its presence or absence, its deployment or its suppression, made a measurable difference to the quality of governance in the kingdoms where these women lived. The history of medieval Europe is, in significant part, a history of the presence and absence of this resource, of the kingdoms that used it well and the kingdoms that wasted it, of the women who found ways to deploy their capabilities despite the structural constraints that worked against them, and the women who were defeated by those constraints before they could fully develop what they had. The pregnancies that punctuated a medieval queen's adult life were simultaneously the most private and the most public aspects of her existence. The queen's body was, in the most literal possible sense, a political instrument, the vehicle through which dynastic continuity was secured, through which the succession was established, through which the alliance between two noble houses was consummated in the most concrete possible way. A queen who produced heirs was fulfilling her primary obligation. A queen who failed to produce heirs was failing at the most fundamental level of her role, regardless of whatever else she might achieve. This is a brutal assessment by any standard, and it was experienced as such by the women who lived under it, who understood that their value in the eyes of the political world was measured primarily in the number and gender and survival rates of the children their bodies produced. The survival rates were terrible by modern standards. Infant mortality in medieval Europe was catastrophically high. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 20 and 50% of children died before reaching the age of 5, depending on the period and the region and the specific health conditions of the community. Noble children fared somewhat better than commoner children because they had access to better nutrition and better medical care, but they still died at rates that would be considered catastrophic today. A queen who bore 8 children might expect to raise 4 or 5 to adulthood. She might expect to lose 1 or 2 in infancy, 1 or 2 in childhood, and face the additional risks of war and accident and disease that claimed young people throughout the medieval period. The childbirth itself was dangerous. Medieval obstetric practice, while not entirely without skill, midwives accumulated considerable practical knowledge through experience, and some of the plant medicines used in childbirth management had genuine pharmacological effects, was operating without the understanding of infection, without reliable pain management, without surgical capability for the complications that sometimes required it, and without the ability to deal effectively with the hemorrhage that was the most common cause of maternal death in childbirth. Queens died in childbirth. The historical record contains numerous examples. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, dying 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. Joanna of Navarre dying in childbirth at 27. Countless others whose names are less well remembered, but whose deaths were no less real. The month before a royal birth, the Queen entered a confinement period, a withdrawal from the public life of the court, into the specifically prepared lying-in chamber, a room that was hung with tapestries on every surface including the windows, reducing the light to a specific quality that medieval medical theory believed was beneficial for the pregnant woman and the unborn child. The tapestries themselves were chosen with care, ideally depicting peaceful, pleasant scenes, because it was believed that the images a pregnant woman looked at could influence the character and appearance of the child she was carrying. The room was kept warm, the windows sealed against drafts. The atmosphere managed to create a specific kind of enclosed, controlled environment that was intended to minimize the risks of the birth. The ladies who attended the Queen in the lying-in chamber were exclusively female. No men were permitted, including the king, the physicians, the priests, and any other male member of the household. This was one of the few spaces in the Queen's life that was genuinely female, genuinely private from male observation, and the specific female community that formed around the birthing Queen was a space of intimacy and mutual support that existed nowhere else in the Queen's experience. The midwife who managed the birth was the most important person in that room. More important in the specific circumstances of the birth than the Queen herself or any of the noble ladies who attended her, and the relationship between the Queen and her midwife was one of genuine trust and genuine dependency that was unlike almost any other relationship in the Queen's life. After the birth, assuming the birth went well, assuming the child was alive and the queen was alive and the enormous anxiety of the lying-in period was resolved in the best possible way, the child was immediately assessed for gender. A boy was the ideal outcome, for reasons that are obvious in the context of a dynastic system where succession passed through the male line. The announcement of a male heir produced a specific kind of court celebration, a relief and a joy that was genuine and political simultaneously. Genuine because people in the court cared about the queen and were relieved that she had survived. Political because the succession question was answered, and the political stability that a clear succession provided was real and valuable. The announcement of a female child produced a more muted response. The child was welcomed, the queen's survival was celebrated, but the succession question remained open, and the pressure to produce a male heir continued. The queen who produced only daughters faced a specific and grinding political pressure that accumulated with each birth, that was experienced in the increasingly urgent conversations with the king and the council about the succession, in the prayers and the pilgrimages and the specific religious observances that were undertaken to secure the divine favour that might produce the desired outcome, in the growing awareness that the failure to produce a male heir was being attributed to her, to some deficiency in her body, some sin in her past, some failure of her piety or her virtue, rather than to the biological reality that the determination of the child's sex had nothing to do with the mother. The specific cruelty of this attribution, of placing on the woman the responsibility for an outcome that she had no biological ability to control, was not a medieval invention. It has appeared in every culture and every era that has placed a high value on male heirs and a corresponding pressure on women to produce them. But the medieval form of it was particularly intense because the political stakes were so high and the biological understanding so limited and the theological framework so willing to interpret natural events as divine judgments on human behaviour. A queen who produced only daughters was not just failing biologically. She was, in the medieval understanding, potentially being punished, and the question of what she had done to deserve the punishment was one that her enemies were always willing to help answer. Let your thoughts drift now. The lying-in chamber with its tapestried walls and its warm enclosed air and its community of women around the bed. The queen in the aftermath of a birth, exhausted and relieved and already calculating, already thinking about what this birth means for the succession, for the king's mood, for her own position in the court, for the alliances that the child's gender will strengthen or complicate. The specific combination of physical vulnerability and political alertness that was the queen's permanent condition, present even in the moments of greatest physical demand. The sound of a newborn in the room, the sound that meant everything had gone as well as it could go, the sound that the queen had been listening for through the whole long, dangerous process of the birth, the sound that meant she had survived and her child had survived, and the dynasty would continue for another generation, and the pressure would ease, at least for a while, at least until the next pregnancy, at least until the political world remembered what it was always going to remember, that there was still more to do, more to secure, more to manage. The night candles were burning low in the lying-in chamber. Outside the sealed windows the world was going about its business, the court functioning without her for the weeks of the confinement period, the king making decisions without her counsel, the political landscape shifting in ways she could not fully observe or influence. She was at her most vulnerable and at her most protected simultaneously. Protected by the female community of the lying-in chamber, vulnerable to everything that was happening beyond its walls. She would be back. She was always back. This is the thing about the medieval queens, whose stories survive in enough detail to be understood. They came back. They emerged from imprisonment and resumed governing. They emerged from confinement and resumed politicking. They emerged from grief and resumed managing. The capacity to continue, to return to the work after the interruption, to pick up the threads of influence and information and relationship that had been dropped during the crisis and weave them back into the fabric of political life. This capacity was as much a part of medieval queenship as any specific skill or any specific achievement. The work was never finished. The court was always moving, always generating new alliances and new conflicts and new crises and new opportunities. The queen who stopped paying attention for a moment was the queen who missed something important. The queen who let grief or illness or exhaustion remove her from the constant management of her position was the queen who returned to find that her enemies had used her absence well, and that the ground she had lost would have to be won back at cost. She rested when she could. She wept when no one was watching. She prayed in the genuine and private language she had developed for talking to God in the dark, the language beneath the prescribed words, the language that was entirely her own. And then she got up and went back to work, because the work was what she was, and because the alternative to the work was something that she had looked at clearly enough to understand she did not want it, would not accept it, would resist it with everything she had for as long as she had anything left to resist with. This is what a medieval queen was, not the woman in the tower, not the passive object of the troubledour's admiration, not the fairy tale figure waiting for something to happen. A person doing an extraordinarily difficult job in extraordinarily difficult circumstances with the tools available to her, which were never the tools she would have chosen, and were often inadequate to the task, and doing it anyway, with a persistence and an intelligence and a particular quality of determined attention that the historical record, when you read it carefully enough, makes impossible to miss. Rest now. The lying-in chamber is quiet. The child is sleeping. The candles are very low. The queen is still, her eyes closed, her body finally at rest after everything it has given and everything it has endured. The castle is breathing slowly around her. The night is doing what the night does, holding everything in its dark, patient, indifferent embrace, making no promises about the morning, but delivering it anyway, as it always has, as it always will. Sleep now. The crisis came, as crises in medieval queenship almost always came, without warning and from a direction that had not been fully anticipated. This is one of the defining features of the position. Not that crises were unexpected in the abstract, because a medieval queen who had been paying attention understood that crises were not occasional disruptions to normal life, but the normal texture of political existence, the permanent background condition against which everything else was managed. What could not be anticipated was the specific form the crisis would take, the specific moment it would arrive, the specific combination of circumstances that would make this particular challenge more dangerous than the 100 other challenges that had been navigated and survived. The queen was always prepared for crisis in general. She was never fully prepared for the specific crisis that actually came. For many medieval queens, the most dangerous crisis was not military, not dynastic, not financial, but personal. The crisis of the king's affection redirected elsewhere. The medieval royal marriage was, as we have established, a political institution as much as a personal one, and the political dimensions of the marriage were in many ways more stable than the personal ones. The alliance between two noble houses that the marriage represented did not dissolve because the king had become interested in someone else. The queen's formal position, her title, her household, her children's legitimacy, none of these were immediately threatened by the king's infidelity, which was so common as to be essentially assumed in most medieval courts. The rules of the game, as everyone understood them, permitted the king a degree of personal freedom that was not permitted to the queen, and a wise queen learned to manage this asymmetry without allowing it to destabilize her political position. The management of this asymmetry was one of the most delicate and most practically demanding aspects of medieval queenship, and the queens who managed it well, who neither ignored the reality nor allowed it to consume them, who found ways to maintain their relationship with the king, even in the presence of the complications that the king's other relationships created, were queens who demonstrated a specific kind of emotional intelligence alongside their political intelligence. They understood that the king's affection was a political resource as well as a personal one, that the queen who maintained her husband's respect and goodwill was the queen who retained her influence over his decisions and her access to his attention, and that the queen who allowed the personal resentment of his infidelities to poison the political relationship was the queen who was damaging her own position. This is not to say that the emotional reality of the situation was irrelevant, or that the queens who managed it well were not experiencing genuine pain. The historical record, in the fragments of private correspondence and the testimony of contemporaries who were paying close attention, suggests that many medieval queens experienced the king's other relationships with a combination of real personal hurt and rigorous political management, that the public composure was not the absence of the private feeling, but its discipline, the specific skill of a woman who had learned that what she showed in public was a political choice with political consequences, and who made that choice even when the private feeling was very strong. The specific danger came when the king's interest in another woman moved from the personal to the political, when the other woman began to exercise the kind of influence over the king's decisions that was supposed to be the queen's domain, when she began to function as an alternative source of counsel and patronage and political management, when the king began to listen to her rather than to his wife on matters that affected the governance of the kingdom. This was the point at which the queen's political position was genuinely threatened, and it was the point at which the most capable queens responded with the most focused attention and the most creative political management. The royal mistress who accumulated genuine political influence was, from the queen's perspective, not primarily a personal rival, but a political one, a competitor for the resource of the king's attention and trust that was the foundation of the queen's own power. The strategies that medieval queens deployed against politically powerful royal mistresses were the same strategies they deployed against any political rival. The cultivation of counter-alliances, the management of information to the king's ear, the careful neutralization of the mistress's support networks, and the patient attention to the moment when the king's interest would inevitably shift, as it always did, and the political structures the mistress had built would be available for dismantlement. The most extreme version of this danger, the version that produced the most dramatic stories in the historical record, was the king who wanted to end the marriage entirely. This was, in the constitutional framework of medieval Christendom, extraordinarily difficult. The Church's teaching on the indissolubility of marriage was clear and consistently enforced, at least in principle. A valid marriage, one that had been properly contracted, that had been consummated, and that had no defect of consent or canonical impediment at the time of its making, could not be dissolved, not by the king, not by the pope, not by anyone. The marriage could be declared to have never existed, annulled, on the grounds that some defect in its formation made it invalid from the beginning. But this was a different matter from divorce, and the grounds for annulment were limited and specific. The discovery, or the fabrication, of grounds for annulment was therefore one of the most consequential legal and theological exercises that a medieval king could undertake, and the queens who were targeted by this exercise were forced to defend not just their personal position, but the validity of their marriage, to demonstrate in the most public and most legally formal possible forum that the relationship they had entered into years or decades earlier had been validly contracted and was therefore indissoluble. The defense of a marriage against an annulment proceeding was a legal defense, a theological defense, and a personal defense simultaneously, requiring the queen to mobilize every resource available to her, her own legal and theological advisers, the support of her family's political allies, the sympathy of the public, and whatever influence she retained with the Pope and the ecclesiastical hierarchy that had the formal authority to decide the question. Catherine of Aragon's defence of her marriage to Henry VIII is the most famous example of this kind of resistance in the entire history of medieval and early modern queenship. And while it falls slightly outside the period we have been primarily considering, it is so representative of the structural dynamics of queenship that it deserves careful attention. Catherine had been married to Henry for 24 years when he began his attempt to have the marriage annulled on the grounds that she had previously been married to his elder brother Arthur, who had died in 1502. Catherine maintained throughout the long legal and political battle that followed, a battle that lasted 7 years and ultimately ended with the English Church breaking from Rome and Henry creating a new ecclesiastical structure that would give him the answer the Roman Church refused to provide, that her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she had been a virgin when she married Henry, and that the marriage was therefore valid and indissoluble. The specific legal and theological question of whether the marriage had been consummated was, in the circumstances, unanswerable with certainty. The relevant events had occurred more than 20 years earlier. The principal witness was dead, and the surviving evidence consisted primarily of the conflicting testimonies of people with strong interests in reaching particular conclusions. Catherine maintained her position with a consistency and a dignity that impressed even people who were working against her, continuing to style herself as queen even after Henry had formally married Anne Boleyn and the English Church had declared the first marriage invalid. She refused to accept the annulment. She refused to retire to a convent, which would have simplified Henry's situation considerably, and which she was repeatedly pressured to do. She appealed to Rome, to her nephew the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, to anyone who had the power and the inclination to support her position. She died in 1536, still styling herself queen, having never conceded the point. The specific quality of Catherine's resistance, the absolute refusal to accept a redefinition of reality that she believed was false, the maintenance of her position under pressure that would have broken most people, the combination of personal courage and theological conviction, and political calculation that sustained her through years of increasing isolation and hardship, is representative of something that appears across the historical record of medieval queens in crisis. The women who survived the worst that medieval queenship could produce were the women who had a core of something that the pressure could not reach, a sense of their own identity and their own position that was not dependent on the external validation of the court, or the king, or the political structures that were trying to unmake them. This quality is difficult to name precisely. It is not simply stubbornness, though it included stubbornness. It is not simply courage, though it included courage. It is something closer to what we might call integrity in the deepest sense of the word. The quality of remaining integrated, of holding together as a coherent self in circumstances that were designed to fragment and dissolve that coherence. The queen who retained her sense of who she was when everything around her was insisting that she was someone else. That she was not the queen, but the former queen, not the wife, but the former wife, not the mother of the heir, but the mother of an illegitimate child. This queen was demonstrating a psychological resilience that was, in the context of the pressures she faced, genuinely heroic. The political uses of piety in a medieval queen's life extended far beyond the morning and evening prayers and the observance of the canonical hours that structured her day. Piety was a political language, a medium in which the queen could communicate things that could not be communicated directly, could make claims about her character and her intentions that were simultaneously personal and political, could build alliances with the ecclesiastical institutions that were among the most powerful in medieval Europe. A queen who was known as genuinely devout, who maintained her religious observances with consistency and evident sincerity, who gave generously to religious foundations, who supported the work of specific monastic communities and specific religious orders, was a queen who had allies in the church, and the church's allies were not negligible in medieval political life. The foundation of religious houses was one of the most significant acts of political piety available to a medieval queen, and many queens used it with considerable strategic intelligence. A monastery or a convent founded by the queen and bearing her family's patronage was a permanent institutional presence in the political landscape. A community of people who prayed for the queen's soul and the souls of her family, who maintained the queen's memory in their liturgy and their records, who constituted a network of spiritual and sometimes practical support that extended across generations. The queen who founded religious houses was not simply performing an act of personal devotion. She was building institutions, creating permanent markers of her family's presence and piety in the landscape of the kingdom, and establishing relationships with communities that would outlast her and that would maintain her memory in ways that purely political structures rarely did. The specific relationships that medieval queens maintained with individual religious women, with abbesses and mystics and holy women whose spiritual authority was recognized and whose counsel was sought across the social spectrum, were among the most interesting and least studied aspects of their lives. The abbess of a major convent was a woman of significant institutional power. She governed a community, managed resources, maintained relationships with the secular world, and exercised a kind of authority that was formally religious but practically indistinguishable in many of its dimensions from secular governance. The relationship between a queen and a powerful abbess was a relationship between two women who each understood the specific challenges of governing complex institutions under significant constraints, and it was often a relationship of genuine mutual respect and genuine political usefulness. The mystics, women like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, whose visions and whose written works on theology and medicine and natural history made her one of the most remarkable intellects of the medieval period, or Julian of Norwich in the 14th century, whose revelations of divine love contained some of the most profound theological writing in the English language, occupied a specific and important place in medieval religious culture that gave them a kind of authority that was genuinely unusual for women in their world. The mystics' authority came from direct divine communication, from visions and revelations that were understood as genuine contacts with the divine, and that gave the mystics' pronouncements a weight that no purely human authority could match. Popes and kings and queens sought the counsel of recognized mystics, not because they were naive or credulous, but because the mystic occupied a specific role in the medieval understanding of how God communicated with humanity, and because the political value of divine endorsement or divine warning was real and recognized. Hildegard of Bingen is worth pausing on at some length because her life illuminates aspects of medieval women's intellectual and spiritual existence that are essential to understanding the full range of what was possible for a woman of exceptional ability in the medieval world, even within the significant constraints of that world. She was born in 1098, the 10th child of a noble family, and was offered to the church as a tithe, literally as 1/10 of the family's children, at the age of approximately 8, entering religious life as an oblate attached to the Benedictine monastery of Disibodenberg, under the guidance of a holy woman named Jutta of Sponheim. The oblation of children to religious life was a common practice in medieval Europe that looks, from a modern perspective, like an extraordinary deprivation of personal choice, and from the perspective of the child it may well have been experienced as such. From another perspective, it was the mechanism that gave a small number of exceptionally gifted women access to the intellectual resources and the institutional support that allowed them to develop their abilities to a degree that would have been impossible in secular life. The monastery had a library. The monastery provided formal education in Latin, in theology, in music, in the full range of medieval intellectual culture. The monastery offered a framework of daily life that was demanding and constrictive in specific ways, and liberating in others. Liberating from the specific demands of marriage, and childbearing and household management, which freed the time and the energy that those demands consumed for other purposes. Hildegard was educated at Disse-Bodenberg, succeeded Jutta as the head of the female community there after Jutta's death in 1136, and then spent the rest of her extraordinarily productive life doing things that no woman of her era was supposed to be able to do. She wrote 3 major theological works: a book of natural history and medicine, a book of musical compositions that are still performed today, a collection of letters to popes and emperors and kings and queens and abbots and ordinary people, and a variety of smaller works covering an astonishing range of subjects. She founded 2 new convents. She undertook 4 preaching tours of the Rhineland, speaking publicly to mixed audiences of clergy and laity in a period when women were formally prohibited from preaching. She maintained a correspondence with Bernard of Clairvaux, with Pope Eugenius III, with Frederick Barbarossa, with Eleanor of Aquitaine, with virtually every significant figure in the intellectual and political life of 12th century Europe. The authority from which she did all of this was the authority of her visions, the direct divine communication that had begun when she was a child and that she had kept largely private until, at the age of approximately 42, she received what she described as a divine command to write down what she saw and heard. The Civias, Know the Ways, was the first major product of this command, a theological and visionary work that she spent 10 years writing, and that once it received the formal endorsement of Pope Eugenius III at the Synod of Trier in 1147 or 1148, established her as a recognized authority in the Church whose works could be disseminated, and whose counsel could be sought without the suspicion of heresy or delusion that always threatened women who claimed spiritual authority. The specific mechanism of Hildegard's authority, the vision as the source of the woman's right to speak in a world that otherwise denied her that right, is one of the most interesting aspects of medieval women's spiritual culture. The vision was the loophole. It was the one form of authority that the Church could not simply deny to women, because the denial would require the denial of the possibility of direct divine communication, which the Church's own theology affirmed. A woman who said, "I have opinions about theology," could be dismissed. A woman who said, "God showed me this in a vision," was considerably harder to dismiss, because dismissing her required either calling her a liar, which was a serious accusation that required evidence, or calling her a vehicle of demonic rather than divine inspiration, which required engaging with the content of the visions and demonstrating their internal theological errors. Hildegard was careful about this. She was careful to present her visions in the proper theological framework, to submit them to the appropriate ecclesiastical authorities for evaluation, to surround herself with the male advisors and endorsers whose presence validated her work within the institutional structures of the Church. She was not naive about the specific vulnerability of her position. She was also not willing to be silenced by that vulnerability. The combination, the full awareness of the constraints, and the full commitment to operating at the limit of what those constraints permitted, is characteristic of the most effective women of the medieval period across all of the roles and contexts we have been considering. The queen who understood her constraints completely and operated at their limit was the queen who achieved the most. The abbess who understood the specific permissions and prohibitions of her position and used the permissions exhaustively was the abbess who built the most significant institution. The mystic who understood the theological framework that permitted her authority and worked within it while pushing its boundaries was the mystic whose influence extended furthest. The framework was real, the constraint was real, and the intelligence that found the maximum possible space within the framework was also real. And it produced real results, and those results mattered in the world. The education available to medieval noble women was, as we have noted, less systematic and less extensive than the education available to noble men. But it was not nothing, and in some specific contexts it was considerably more than the general picture suggests. The convents that educated the daughters of noble families provided, at their best, a genuine intellectual formation. Latin, theology, music, the liberal arts in their medieval form. The households of powerful noble women sometimes maintained the kind of cultural environment that attracted scholars and poets and musicians, and provided, through proximity and conversation and access to books, an informal education that supplemented or replaced the formal kind. The women who emerged from these environments with genuine intellectual formation, who could read and write in Latin as well as in their vernacular languages, who were familiar with the major theological texts and the major literary traditions, who could engage with the intellectual life of their era rather than simply observing it from the outside, were women who had access to a range of political and cultural tools that less educated women did not. The queen who could read the documents her advisers placed before her, rather than depending on them to tell her what the documents said, was the queen who retained a degree of independence that her dependence on her advisers would otherwise have eliminated. The queen who could write her own letters in the specific rhetorical forms that medieval Latin correspondence demanded, was the queen who could communicate with precision and without intermediaries, when precision and directness were what the situation required. The specific literacy of medieval queens varied enormously, from women who were fully literate in Latin and multiple vernacular languages, and who were serious intellectual patrons, and sometimes serious intellectual contributors, to women who could read in their vernacular language, but not in Latin, to women who were functionally illiterate, and who depended entirely on their secretaries and chaplains for any written communication. The variation reflected differences in individual opportunity, in family emphasis, in the specific religious and educational environments that different women had been exposed to, and in the particular political circumstances that had or had not created incentives for developing specific intellectual skills. What is consistent across the range is the relationship between education and political effectiveness. The queens who were most literate were not automatically the most politically effective. Political effectiveness depended on too many other variables to be reducible to any single factor, but literacy provided a specific set of tools that enhanced the capacity for political action, and the queens who had those tools could deploy them in ways that the queens who lacked them could not. The letter that the queen wrote herself, in her own hand, in the specific rhetorical register that communicated intimacy and urgency simultaneously, was a different political instrument from the letter dictated to a secretary and signed at the bottom. Both were letters. One was an extension of the queen's self into the world, carrying something of her specific intelligence and her specific voice. The other was a document. The garden in the afternoon, the needlework room, the lying-in chamber, the presence chamber with its hierarchies of access. All of these spaces were spaces in which the queen's intelligence and her relationships and her accumulated understanding of the political world she navigated were constantly at work, constantly building and maintaining and adjusting the structures that sustained her position. The work was never visible in the way that military campaigns were visible, or legal reforms were visible, or the founding of institutions was visible. It was the invisible work of relationship management and information management and impression management, and the constant patient attention to the political landscape that was the Queen's primary professional activity, and that left almost no direct traces in the historical record. This invisibility is the most important thing to understand about the history of medieval queenship. The absence of evidence for the Queen's political activity is not evidence of the absence of political activity. It is evidence of the specific nature of the work that was conducted in private conversations and personal letters, and the management of access and the cultivation of relationships, Work that was specifically designed not to be visible, work that was most effective precisely when it was least detectable. The queen who left no traces in the Chronicles may have been the queen who was most effective, because the most effective political management is often the management that produces outcomes without anyone being quite able to say afterward how those outcomes came about. Let your thoughts drift on the current of that understanding. The invisible work, the conversations that never made it into the Chronicles, the letters that were burned after reading, the relationships maintained through years of small attentions and small kindnesses and small demonstrations of memory and care, that constituted, accumulated over time, the most durable form of political capital available to a woman in the medieval world. The intelligence that left almost no traces and shaped almost everything. The night is deep and the castle is quiet, and somewhere in the darkness a candle is still burning in a room where someone is still working, still reading or writing or thinking, still attending to the work that the day never fully exhausted, still finding, in the hours when the court was asleep and the performances could be laid down and the masks could be removed, the quiet necessary for the kind of thinking that the noise of the day made impossible. The queen is still. What does it mean for us here in this different world that is not entirely different, that has eliminated some of the medieval constraints and retained others and created new ones that the medieval world could not have anticipated? What does the story of the medieval queen offer to a person lying in the dark in the 21st century, listening to a soft voice recount the details of a world that ended 500 years ago? It offers the recognition that the gap between what we are and what our circumstances permit us to be is not a modern problem. It is a permanent feature of human existence, the permanent tension between capability and constraint, between what a person could do and what the world makes room for. Every person who has ever lived has navigated this tension in the specific form that their specific historical moment gave it. The medieval queen navigated it in her form, we navigate it in ours. The form changes. The tension does not. It offers the recognition that the constraint does not determine the outcome, that the same formal situation inhabited by different people with different capabilities and different commitments produces dramatically different results. The position of medieval queen was the same formal position for every woman who occupied it. What was done with that position varied enormously across the full range from negligible to world-changing, and the variation was produced not by the position but by the people, by the specific intelligence and the specific will and the specific courage and the specific persistence of the individuals who found themselves in that position and had to decide what to make of it. This is in the end the most important thing that the history of medieval queenship has to say to us. Not the specific historical facts, fascinating as they are, not the specific stories, compelling as they are, but the fundamental recognition that circumstances do not fully determine outcomes, that the gap between the constraint and the capability is always real, and that what is done in that gap is always, to some significant degree, a choice. Not an unlimited choice. The medieval queen did not have unlimited choices, and neither do we, but a real choice with real consequences, available to a real person who is genuinely capable of exercising it in whatever specific form and whatever specific context the world has provided. Eleanor chose to go to the crusade. She chose to support the rebellion against her husband. She chose to endure the imprisonment rather than capitulate. She chose to return to active political life at 67 and to manage the kingdom and raise the ransom and escort the payment to Germany and attend the release of her son and continue working until very near the end. Each of those choices was made within constraints that were real and significant and not of her making. Each of those choices was also genuinely a choice, a decision by a specific person about what to do with what she had in the specific moment she was in. Hildegard chose to write. She chose to preach. She chose to found new communities. She chose to maintain the correspondence that connected her to the political and intellectual life of her era. She chose to use the authority of the vision which was available to her as the platform for saying the things she needed to say, which would not have been available to her by any other route. The framework that made her authority possible was not of her making. What she did with that framework was entirely her own. Blanche chose to govern, she chose to fight when fighting was required, and to negotiate when negotiation was the better instrument. She chose to manage the transition from regent to dowager with the imperfect grace that the situation permitted. She chose to serve as regent again in her 70s, when her son's crusade required it. The circumstances that put her in the position of needing to make those choices were not of her choosing. The choices themselves were entirely hers. These women are not held up as perfect models to be imitated. They were human beings with human limitations, who made choices that were sometimes excellent and sometimes not, who caused harm as well as good, who operated within frameworks that were themselves unjust, and that their own choices sometimes perpetuated. They are held up as evidence that the gap between constraint and capability is always real, evidence that what is done in that gap matters, evidence that the specific quality of a person's attention to their own situation and the specific quality of their commitment to doing something real with what they have shapes outcomes in ways that the formal structures of their world could not have predicted and did not intend. You are somewhere in your own gap tonight, between what you are capable of and what the specific circumstances of your specific moment permit. The gap is a different shape from Eleanor's gap or Hildegard's gap or Blanche's gap, because the world is different and the circumstances are different, and the specific forms of constraint and capability available in the 21st century are different from the forms available in the 12th. But the structure of the situation is the same, the tension is the same, and the fact that something can be done in the gap, that the gap is not simply a deficit, not simply the distance between what you are and what you cannot be, but a space in which something real and significant and yours can be made. This fact is the same. The medieval queen did not wait for the world to give her the formal authority to do what she needed to do. She built from what was available the actual capacity to do it anyway. She cultivated the relationships that gave her access to the decisions that her formal position did not give her authority over. She managed the information that her position gave her access to with a precision and a purpose that produced outcomes the people who designed her position had not anticipated. She performed what needed to be performed and was, in the private spaces between the performances, entirely and completely herself, thinking, planning, feeling, deciding, choosing, doing the invisible work that left the most visible traces in the shape of the world she inhabited. This is the inheritance she leaves us, not the specific facts of her specific life, though those facts are worth knowing. Not the romantic story of the queen in the castle, though the castle was real and the queen was real and the story properly understood is worth telling. The inheritance she leaves us is the demonstration, clear and repeated and consistent across the centuries and the specific individuals, that the gap between what you are and what your circumstances permit is not a wall, it is a workshop, and what is made in it is yours. The night is almost over. Not quite. There is still darkness outside the windows, still the specific quality of the deep night that comes in the hours before dawn, when the world is at its quietest, and the threshold between sleeping and waking is at its most permeable. But the night is tending toward its end, the way all nights tend toward their ends, the way everything that has a beginning tends, eventually, toward whatever comes after. The queen is sleeping, or she is lying still in the dark behind the bed curtains, breathing slowly, suspended in the specific limbo between the end of one day and the beginning of the next, between the accumulated weight of everything that has already happened and the open, unresolved space of everything that has not yet. In that suspension, in that particular stillness that the deepest hours of the night produce, There is something that the daylight hours do not offer, a quality of openness, a sense of possibility that the noise and the performance and the constant management of the waking hours crowds out, and that returns quietly and without announcement, in the dark. What she sees in that darkness, what she thinks about in those unhurried pre-dawn minutes, what she reaches toward in the quiet that is finally, genuinely, unheld by anyone else's expectations or anyone else's needs. This is the part of her the historical record cannot touch. This is the part that was entirely her own, that she carried through all the years of the performance, without ever surrendering, that was there in the vigil of the dark church, and there in the morning prayers, and there in the audience chamber, and there in the garden, and there in the needlework room, and there in the lying-in chamber, and there in all the hours of all the days that constituted a life. That part is not gone. It was not archived. It was not lost when the castle crumbled, or the chronicle was burned, or the letter was destroyed. It passed forward the way all things that are genuinely alive pass forward, not intact, not unchanged, but present, in the specific way that the past is always present in the form of what it produced, and what it failed to produce, and what it tried to produce, and what it taught the people who came after it about what was possible and what was worth attempting. You are what it produced, not you alone. Everyone who has ever lived in the world that the medieval queens and the medieval knights and the ancient Aztecs and the Maya astronomers and the Spartans and the Egyptians and all the rest of the long human procession shaped is what they produced. But you are part of it. You carry forward, without knowing most of what you carry, the accumulated result of all those lives lived in all those gaps between constraint and capability, all that invisible work, all those choices made in circumstances that did not make the choosing easy but that made it nonetheless real. The thread continues, it has always continued, it will continue after us, carrying forward things we cannot anticipate into futures we cannot imagine, maintained by people who will not know our names but who will nonetheless be shaped by what we have done and left undone, by the choices we made in our own specific gaps between what we were and what our world made room for. This is not a small thing, it is in the most precise and most honest sense of the word, everything. Let your breath go completely now. Let the last thoughts of the night drift where they will, toward the queen in her castle, or the astronomer watching Venus rise, or the farmer tending the corn, or the knight kneeling in the dark church, or the mystic writing her visions, or the mother grinding grain before the light comes. Let them drift and slow and settle, like sediment in still water, like snow falling in a windless field, like the last notes of a song that was worth singing, and that has now been sung, and that will continue, in the way that songs continue after they have ended, in the body of the person who heard it. The darkness is complete, and the castle is completely still, and the medieval night is holding everything in its enormous, patient, indifferent embrace, making no promises and keeping none except the one it always keeps, that the night will end, that the light will come, that the morning will be there when you open your eyes, ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, the way all mornings are. Sleep now, the work is done for tonight. The thinking is done, the choosing is done, the thread is held. Everything that needed to be carried forward is being carried by you, by the fact of your being here in this darkness listening to this story about people who were also here once, in their own darknesses, carrying their own threads, doing what they could with what they had. It is enough. It has always been enough. It will always be enough. Sleep.